Cher Peter, dear Peter, little French before. Nous sommes tous très honorés ici chez Cap Digital de votre visite à l'occasion de la sortie de votre livre en français, de 0 à 1, je montre à l'envers, pardon. Et au nom du conseil d'administration de Cap Digital, de son président Stéphane Distinguin et de toute l'équipe, nous vous en remercions. Cap Digital is greatly honored to welcome you today and extends you the warmest welcomes from our board, and represented now, our president, Stéphane Distinguin, and all the team from Cap Digital here. Thanks also to Laurent Lafont and the team at les éditions Jean-Claude Lattès. Thanks to Gilles Fontaine from the magazine Challenge for all the help as well. Peter, vous êtes ici chez vous. Feel yourself at home here. Since 2006, and during the past 10 years, Cap Digital, the biggest cluster for digital transformation in Europe, helped and supported its 1,000 members. Peter, you are an investor and an entrepreneur. I'm always proud and pleased to remember that entrepreneur is a French word invented by Jean-Baptiste Say. Peter first gained attention for his attempt to replace the dollar by starting PayPal, which did not achieve that ultimate goal, but did change the way payments worked in the world. After bringing PayPal public and then selling it to eBay, he has become known as the Dawn of PayPal Mafia. His ex-colleagues became also successful, SpaceX, LinkedIn, YouTube, to say the least. In 2004, Peter, you created Palantir Technologies. You now want to identify and support the next generation of technology companies, and some of them are here, I think. So, well, it's now time to hear you, Peter, and be sure that here in France and in Cap Digital, we do love and share your revolutionary ideas.
Thank you so much, folks. I'm Julie over here. Thank you so much for having me. I thought I'd make some brief comments and then try to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers and make it as interactive as possible. One of the big challenges in writing a book about entrepreneurship, in teaching about entrepreneurship, about startups, is that I always think that there's no formula. That if I told you this is the formula, these are the steps you must follow, then that would almost be a sign that there was something very wrong with it. And it's because I think every moment in the history of business happens only once. The next Mark Zuckerberg will not be starting a social networking site. The next Bill Gates will not be starting an operating system. The next Larry Page will not be starting a search engine. And so if you are just copying these people, you're in some way not learning from them at all. And so, so the challenge is, in some ways then becomes, what can one say about this topic at all? Everything's unique, everything's new, but what can you say with any more rigor? And so the approach that I try to take is an indirect approach. I try to ask these somewhat contrarian, indirect questions to get the reader, get the entrepreneur to think in new, fresh ways. And I think that's one of the ways to get started. And so the contrarian intellectual question that I always like to ask, even as an interview question, is tell me something that is true that almost nobody agrees with you on. And this turns out to be a shockingly difficult question for people to answer. And it's not so much because you have to be really brilliant, because I think almost everybody has some answer to this question. Everybody knows some things that are true that not very many people agree with you on. But it is a psychologically or socially awkward question to answer, because a good answer is one that the person who's asking the question won't agree with. So if you say things like, our school system doesn't work, our politics are bad, those all may be true answers, but they're not very interesting. Everybody agrees with them. The good answers are ones that people do not agree with and are therefore going to somehow be quite a bit more uncomfortable. The business version of this question is, what sort of a great business is nobody starting? And this, again, is often a much more uncomfortable question to answer because we always are more comfortable with things that have already been done. Lots of people are doing it. We're doing the same thing as everybody else. And that can, of course, work. Whereas if it's something totally different, why would you think that works? Why does it make sense? You run into all those kinds of questions. So I want to give three or so of my answers to this question. It's things I believe to be true that very few people agree with me on, and use this as sort of a starting point for our conversation. And the first one is this very provocative one on this idea of unique businesses itself, sort of the extreme formulation. But I think that most people think that capitalism and competition sort of are synonyms. They mean the same thing. I believe that capitalism and competition are antonyms. They mean opposites. A capitalist is someone who's in the business of accumulating capital. A world of perfect competition is a world where all the capital is competed away. And so if you are starting a business, if you're an entrepreneur, you're an early investor, early employee, you always want to be in a monopoly. Now, we can sort of debate when monopolies are good for society or bad for society, but from the inside, you always want to be in a monopoly. You want to be doing something that's unique, that nobody else is doing, where there's no competition at all. And then if you want to have crazy competition, you should just open a restaurant. This is an absolutely terrible idea. It's an especially terrible idea in a place like Paris or San Francisco, where I live. It doesn't stop many, many people from doing it. And there's almost this inverse relationship where the worse the idea is, the more people do it, in many cases. And if we sort of, and there's sort of, this is a very basic truth, but it's very odd why this is not understood, and why people don't understand the sort of basic economic principle. And I think the first part is that you have to always understand is people always tell themselves lies about how intense the competition is. And so if you take the example of a monopoly, let's say you are Google. It's had no competition in search since 2002. It's had a monopoly in search. It's making crazy amounts of profits for the last 13, 14 years. And rhetorically, if you are the CEO of Google, you will not go on television and say, we have a monopoly that's bigger than the monopoly Microsoft ever had in the 1990s, and the margins are even higher, et cetera, et cetera. And what you will say instead is, we're not really a search engine. We're in this much, much bigger thing called technology. And in technology, there's competition everywhere. We have to compete with Apple's Android phone and Facebook and Amazon. And it's just enormous. Everything's changing. Everything's incredibly competitive in technology. And no, we're not the monopoly the government is looking for. So that's sort of what you have to say as the CEO. Now, parenthetically, I have sort of this conspiracy theory of Google. I think the top 5 people at the company understand something what I told you, and then the other 30,000 below them have no idea why the business works, and they sort of think it's because the free sushi or the lava lamps or all the benefits, and they don't understand that it's because of the extraordinary microeconomics of the business. And now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you were to leave today's talk, I don't believe anything Peter said. I'm just going to go open that restaurant just to prove him wrong. And then if you try to open a restaurant, try to get some people to invest in your restaurant, they'll tell you, well, I don't want to invest in a restaurant. It's a bad business. And then you'll say, but this is going to be, it's one of a kind. It's a unique restaurant. It will be the only British, Nepalese fusion cuisine in Paris. There will be nothing like it, no competition at all. And so if you're a monopoly, you exaggerate the scale of your market to hide the monopoly. If you are in intense competition, you narrow the scale of your market to make it tiny and pretend that you're not competing. But the question you always need to ask is not the rhetorical one of do you exaggerate the size or diminish the size, but what is the truth? What is really going on? And so I think there's always this sort of a context where these things get very distorted, and this is why I think this question of competition and monopoly end up being very, very underexplored. But I think there's another somewhat perverse reason why we don't think about the monopoly question as much. And I think we are in many ways perversely attracted to competition because when you compete with, it's the way our education system works. You compete in school, you win things, and then when you win things, you get to compete again for more things. We believe the things you're competing for are the things that really matter. And competition does have the benefit that when you compete, you get better at that which you're competing on. So if you're in high school and you spend 5 hours a day in the swimming pool swimming on a swim team, you will get to be a better swimmer and you beat the other kids at swimming. And so the competition does make you better at what you're competing on. It just comes at this price that maybe you're losing sight of everything else. And you forget about whether what you're doing makes any sense or matters or is valuable or anything like that. And the sort of autobiographical part of this was I grew up in Northern California, and it was sort of a insanely tracked kind of a thing. I remember already 8th grade, junior high school, in my yearbook, one of my friends wrote in, I know that you will get into Stanford University in 4 years, which is one of the US elite universities. 4 years later, I got into Stanford. I went to Stanford. Then 4 years after that, I got to Stanford Law School, sort of a graduate school in the United States. You sort of win these competitions. When you win the competition, you get to compete again and again and again. And then sort of in my mid-20s, I ended up at a prestigious law firm in Manhattan. And it was one of these very strange places where from the outside, everybody wanted to get in, and on the inside, everybody wanted to get out. I left after 7 months and 3 days, to be precise. One of the people down the hall from me said, as I was leaving, it's good to see you leave. I had no idea it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. And of course, all you had to do was go out the front door and not go back. So it was not quite like a prison like Alcatraz, but it was but psychologically, it was very hard for people to leave because their identity, their sense of who they were, was defined by all the competitions they had won, one after the other over the years. And so I think there is this there's this very strange way where we get caught up in these things. We need to always be very careful about it. They've done these, there a few other perspectives from this competition monopoly dynamic. One of the things you're always told in business school is you want to go after markets that are very big. But I think you want to go after markets where you get to a large share. And that often means that if you're starting, you want to go after a small market. Facebook started with 10,000 students at Harvard University. It was a market that was so small, you couldn't have even written a business plan. People said it's ridiculous, it's too tiny, it's not interesting. And you went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. So that was a good start, and then they sort of built it out in concentric circles. PayPal, we started with power sellers on eBay. It's like 30,000 power sellers in late 99, early 2000. We got to 30% market share after about 3 months. Again, a very good start. And then on the other side, if you have these giant markets that people talk about, that's always sort of a very dangerous sign. There's the clean tech investing in Silicon Valley. It's a bit of a clean tech bubble, 2005 to 2008. And there's a lot that went wrong with the clean tech companies, but one pattern was that every presentation started with the first slide said, we're in this enormous market, it's very, very big, it's called energy, it's measured in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, so you have huge numbers. If we have a fraction of that market, we have a valuable market. And then it turned out that you had just insane levels of competition. You had a thin film solar panel company, you had to compete with 9 other thin film solar panel companies, and then there were 90 other solar panel companies, and then there were windmills, and there was the fracking, and there was Chinese manufacturing. And if you're sort of a tiny fish in a very big ocean, that's always a bad place to be. And so I think you end up with this very counterintuitive question on the market size. There is of course also something about one of the questions I always get asked in these kinds of contexts is, what are some of the themes I see for the future? What are trends I see where the future of technology is going? I always really dislike that question. I'm not a prophet. I can't tell you what's going to happen. I can give you sort of very banal answers like there'll be more people using cell phones in 5 years or something like that. That doesn't really tell you anything whatsoever. But the kind of thought that I've come to is that every stated trend is overrated. So if you hear this is a trend, that's already a little bit exaggerated. So in Silicon Valley, there's a trend around educational software companies, healthcare IT software. These are overrated trends. There's a big trend around SaaS enterprise software, very overrated. If you hear the words big data, cloud computing, maybe artificial intelligence, you need to just run away as fast as you can. You need to think that's fraud, just run away. And the reason you should be nervous about the buzzwords is that when you hear these buzzwords, they are a tell, they're an indication, like in poker, that someone's bluffing and that there's nothing actually there. So if you sort of imagine an elevator pitch for a company where you have a whole series of buzzwords, we're building a mobile platform for SaaS enterprise businesses to bring big data to the cloud. That's exactly what we're doing. And it might be a good business. Certainly, my pattern is that the buzzwords tell you that it's undifferentiated. Because once these categories exist, there's sort of many people in the categories, many people who are doing them, and the thing that the categories obscure is always what's unique, what's differentiated, what makes things one of a kind. And so I think a lot of the best businesses I've encountered over the last decade or so tend to be ones where the categories don't even exist, or maybe they're miscategorized. So Facebook would have been called a social network, and there had been other social networking sites before Facebook, but I would argue that's not really the correct category. Facebook's really about real identity. It's the first one in which you had real identity. People would say Google was a search engine, but it was really the first machine-powered search. So we have the great businesses are in unique categories. They're mislabeled categories, and that's sort of the challenge that one always needs to sort out. This whole there is always this sort of whole question of the conformity in thinking that I'm always pushing against. And the rhetorical way I always like to put this was that already in the time of Shakespeare in English, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And so there is something very deep in human nature where we learn by copying, we learn by imitating one another. That's how we get ideas about, we learn language from our parents. That's how culture is transmitted. But in this sort of business context, that's also where you get clones of clones of clones of clones, and sort of a lot of extremely sterile competition. And I've often thought there's this very strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where many of the very talented founders seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's. They seem to be sort of socially somewhat a little bit maladapted. And I think I always contrast this with people going to business school in the United States. It's a 2-year MBA program typically in the United States. And if you sort of think about the typical person who goes to a business school is someone who's very extroverted, talkative, they talk to other people, they have no real ideas of their own, so not very many convictions. And we sort of do this experiment, and we take all these people with no convictions, but who are very talkative, And you put them into a hothouse environment, you put them in the same place for 2 years, and they talk to one another for 2 years as to what they're going to do next with their lives. And they've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that the largest group of the people always ends up doing the wrong thing. So, in 1989, everybody wanted to work at Harvard Business School. Everyone wanted to work for Michael Milken, the junk bond king. And this was just 1 or 2 years before everything blew up and he went to jail. They were never really interested in technology. 99, 2000, everyone from Harvard Business School sort of descended on Silicon Valley and in a sense timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly. Last decade it was sort of real estate or things like that. So that even though so I think we have to, when we see that there are sort of a lot of these founders are slightly socially maladapted in all these strange ways, I always think we need to turn that around as a critique of our society. And we need to ask the question, what is it about our society that is so screwed up that a normal person who's able to talk to other people, is able to communicate well, is at a disadvantage because you will be talked out of all of your interesting, original, creative ideas before they're even fully formed. You'll pick up on all these social cues. You're looking at people, they'll look at you a little bit funny, and you say, well, maybe I won't do that. I think I'll just go back to opening that restaurant. And I say, oh yeah, that makes sense. You just open that restaurant. And so I do think this question about innovation always runs into these very deep social dynamics. Let me end with one somewhat bigger picture thought on the future of globalization, technology in the 21st century. One of the sort of diagrams I draw out in 0 to 1 is this idea that there are in a good 21st century we will need both globalization and technological progress. But I think these are two words that are often used to mean similar things, but I think they're very different. And I always draw globalization on the x-axis. It's going from 1 to n. It is copying things that work. It is horizontal or extensive growth. And then I draw technology on the y-axis. It's going from 0 to 1, doing new things, intensive or vertical growth. And if we sort of think about the history of the last 200 years in the Western world, there have been periods of globalization and periods of technology, so they don't necessarily overlap. 19th century, 1815 to 1914, was a period of tremendous globalization and tremendous technological progress in all sorts of dimensions. After 1914, World War I starts, globalization goes in reverse, there's less trade, countries become less connected to one another, but technology continues to progress very rapidly in many ways. And then I would argue in 1971, maybe the Kissinger trip to China, globalization begins again. And the last 40, 45 years have been a period of very rapid globalization and somewhat more limited technological progress centered mostly on computers, internet, IT, software, the world of bits, and less technological progress of the sort that one had in the 1950s and 1960s, rockets, Concorde, supersonic planes, green revolution, agriculture, biotech, new medical devices. So there's been sort of we've had some progress the last 40 years, but it's this narrow progress around computers, IT, things like this. So we've had in the 20th century, the last 100 years, we had first a period of technology and no globalization, and then we had a period of globalization and limited technology. And this the shift is, I think we see this in many different forms. It's certainly, it's reflected, and I think that even though we always talk about how there's a ferocious amount of technological change and things are happening all the time, I think there is not that much happening outside of the digital realm. So the cell phones that distract us from our environment also distract us from the many ways in which our environments are strangely old. So whether it's San Francisco or Paris, the subways are very old, the buildings are old. Also, and there's this narrow place where we've had progress, many other ones where we've not. or if you, the culture in our society, I think is deeply anti-technological. And I always just say, all you have to do is just watch the movies that come out of Hollywood. Almost every movie that portrays technology is dystopian, destructive. It shows technology that doesn't work, that kills people, that destroys the planet. It's Terminator with robots running around. It's Avatar with environmental disaster. It's Elysium. It's, I watched, there was the Gravity movie a few years ago where they were on sort of this space station and everything went wrong. And you were so happy to be back on a muddy, tropical, primitive island somewhere. And I think that's, and I'm not blaming Hollywood for this. I think Hollywood just reflects the culture, which is deeply anti-technological. And we also have this reflected, in the way we talk about our world today, where in the 50s and 60s, geopolitically, you would have spoken of a first world and a third world. The first world was the progressing, advancing world. The third world was sort of decoupled and permanently in trouble. So that was a pro-technology, but not a globalization kind of dichotomy. Today, we would speak about the developed countries and the developing countries. The developing countries are the countries that are copying the developed world. So this is a, when you speak of developed, developing, this is a pro-globalization dichotomy. It's about convergence. It's about the world becoming more and more alike as the developing countries copy the developed world and converge with it. But it is also implicitly an anti-technological description. Because when we say that those of us living in the United States or in France, when we say that we live in the developed world, we are saying implicitly that we're living in that part of the world that has been developed, where there's nothing new to do, where everything has been done in the past, and where the younger generation should have lower expectations than their parents. And I think this is a conception of our society that we should very powerfully resist, and that we should we need to find a way to go back to the future. And so I will end with the contrarian question that I think does not get asked enough, but we should ask more. How can we go about developing our so-called developed world? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. So how is your trip so far? Your European trip?
Good. It's always very interesting. You get to just exchange views with people in all sorts of different ways. So you're always tempted to be negative on certain trends and things that are not working. But it is always very encouraging how many people are actually interested. There is a sense that we need to find a new way to get back to the future that I find in France, in Europe, all over the world.
What's your view on the both business and political environment here in Europe right now?
Well, it's always hard to say what's really going on. Certainly, the headlines in the newspapers are generally more pessimistic. There certainly are. I always tend to think that we would be better off if we had somewhat fewer regulations and we're able to. It would be easier to start businesses and so on and so forth. But I do think there's more of an openness to this now than there would have been 10 years ago. So even though in absolute terms I think it's still very hard, I think in relative terms I think things are. I think the trends may be going in the right way.
So you have a few, I guess, entrepreneurs in the room today. What would be your advice, a piece of advice that you could give these entrepreneurs? Things they should do, things that they should never do.
Well, there are many things you should never do. So it's always like it's easier to do the negative, right? So I can say you shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that, shouldn't do this. The positive formula I think is always harder because if I gave you the full positive formula, I already would tell you everything you should do and you'd have a great business, and I would just do it myself or something. But I've often people sometimes ask me, what are my criteria for investing? And even though I don't think there's no formula, if I had to sort of give a little bit of a fake formula, I always say there's three parts. It's the people, it's the technology, it's the business strategy. I want all three. So business strategy, how do you get a monopoly? Technology is why are you doing something that's unique? And the people question, it's never about the individual level of talent. You assume people are reasonably talented. It's always a question, how well do they work together? Because what's very different about a business from an academic setting, academic setting is purely individual, or writing is purely individual. It's just you against the whole world. In a business, it's more like a team. And it's less structured than a sports team. It's, people have different roles. We don't even know what the game is that we're playing. But the question is, how well do people on that team get along? And so I often like asking the prehistory question. When did all of you come together? A bad answer is, oh, we met a week ago at a business networking function and we just wanted to start a company. It doesn't really matter what. So that's sort of, I invested in things like that, and I try not to do that anymore. And then a good answer is more like, we've been friends for 3-4 years. One of us is on the business side, one's on more the technology side, where there's sort of so I think a long prehistory is often a good pattern. One of the things that's always very hard, one of the reasons it's always very hard to evaluate companies is that it's very rare that you can just evaluate them on their own. So it's not like if you're telling me, we have a e-commerce site to sell foie gras, and and we're exporting it all over the world. So that's what we're doing. And the context. Now the reason to be skeptical or whatever, but the context you have to get to is, what are other people doing? How many other people are doing this? And so you cannot evaluate that business by just looking at the people, their business plan, and the their stated strategy. To really evaluate it, you have to actually know what everybody else is doing too. And I think this is why the kind of Shark Tank, these sort of TV shows where you have these pitches, they're incredibly misleading, because they suggest that you can just evaluate the business on its own, and it's always the broader context. When I invested in Facebook in mid-2004, people often ask, oh, well, what did Zuckerberg say, and why were you so impressed in the meeting? And well, he was 19 years old, he was shy, he didn't really talk much at all. The service was growing, we had done our homework, but my friend Reid Hoffman and I had spent a year looking at social networking sites, and we were going to invest no matter what happened in that meeting. And so you're always in this sort of much bigger context, and it's very critical to try to have an understanding of that.
So you mentioned team building. Something very special happened about 15 years ago in Silicon Valley within PayPal. Terrific team. About a dozen of you guys founded in their startups in Silicon Valley. 7 of those are now valued over $1 billion. What happened specifically? Were you just brilliant people, or was there something else?
Yeah, it's always hard to say exactly what worked and why. You have a bigger version of the question about Silicon Valley. Why do things work in Silicon Valley, and how do you copy Silicon Valley or not? We can speculate on that. We had a very talented group of people. 2002, when PayPal was acquired by eBay, in retrospect, was a pretty good time to start new companies. There weren't that many people doing it. There were some very good friendships that have been forged at PayPal that I think were the bases of the founding teams.
The PayPal Mafia.
Of some of the PayPal Mafia teams, subsequent companies. But one variable that I always like to stress is that PayPal was hard. There was sort of a lot that went almost wrong. We had an issue with eBay, we had an issue with Visa and MasterCard, and there were government regulators, and there were marketing challenges, and there were the Russian mafia that was trying to steal all the money. And so there were sort of a lot of different challenges that you had. And so the big lesson that you learned on one level, if you had gone through that 3-4 years later, was you can build a great company, but it's quite hard. This is strangely not the lesson that you learn in most companies. So if you're in a startup that fails, the lesson you learn is you can't build a great company, so next time we'll try something less ambitious. So, and this is, by the way, why I always think that it's somewhat problematic to be in a failed startup, and the sort of celebration of failure that often happens in Silicon Valley is a little bit misleading. So I think failure always has a fairly high cost that it exacts on people. And if you fail, there's nothing you can learn from it. And the most important thing you do if you fail is just to find a way to move on as quickly as possible and try to ignore whatever happened. But then on the other end of the spectrum, if you're in a company where everything just works incredibly well, which I think might have been true of Microsoft or maybe Google, where just you hit on something, and it just seems to work automatically. The people who come out of those companies have also learned very little about startups. And so if you look at the history of Microsoft or Google, even though I think on paper, very talented people, they produced far fewer great companies because somehow they were in an environment where they really did not learn much at all about startups. So I think PayPal had about 200 people at the time of the acquisition on the engineering, product, business. So it was still a relatively small team. And of those 200, you got $7 billion plus companies in the next 13, 14 years. Google probably has 20,000 people like that, and I think it's produced fewer than 7 companies. So, and so I think it's not that they're at least as talented as the people we had at Facebook if you evaluate them on a credential basis or IQ or something like that. But I think it was just they were in this context where you learn really the wrong lessons.
So you're still dreaming of flying cars?
Well, I still think that we would be well off if we made progress in many different directions. We have a tag line on our venture capital website where it says they promised us flying cars and all we got was 140 characters, which always gets interpreted as this anti-Twitter comment. And I don't think it's fair, though, to critique Twitter specifically. Twitter still is a very valuable company. Developed a new communication channel. But I do think that if our civilization is going to be taken to the next level, we need to have innovation in many different domains, and not just in IT, also ideally in a lot of other things. It makes sense for people to focus on IT. This is what's been working the best for the last 30, 40 years. 3/4 of the capital at Founders Fund still gets put into IT-related businesses, internet, software, mobile internet. So I'm not trying to fight that trend, because I think that is still the big trend, and that makes a lot of sense. At the same time, I would say that from the point of view of our society, it would be good if we figured out more ways to innovate in the world of atoms as well. Energy, material science, biotech, medical devices, maybe transportation. So there's sort of a lot of other areas where it would be good to figure out ways to innovate. It's often hard to get the microeconomics to work because it's something about IT where it's easier to get to monopoly, and there's something about many of these other areas where it's harder, even though I think it would be very good for society.
Okay, maybe we could take a few questions from the audience. Mike.
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering, compared to the United States, do you think that France understands how much technology matters? Because it seems that we're a little bit behind. We have no such thing as the Silicon Valley.
Well, I'm not. Let me start by saying I'm not sure anybody is that far behind in the world today. You can get access to information, you can get to the frontier, relatively easily. When Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, and he was 19 years old, he was a sophomore in college, and the critique he heard in Boston was, "You're too young, you're still far behind in your education, you haven't finished your education, how could you possibly start things? You haven't learned everything that you need to learn." And I think the reality was that the frontier, there actually are things that you could do where the frontier is not that far away. There certainly are domains and disciplines where you have to study or work for many years, or the frontier is very far away. So if you become a string theory, physics person, you have to do undergraduate, graduate school, postdoctoral. It's like 20 years before you get to some place where you can do things. In the area of software specifically, I don't think that's true, in general. And so I think the frontier is not that far away. There certainly are advantages Silicon Valley has had over the years. There are network effects, you have the capital, you have the history, you have groups of people. But there also may be disadvantages. And so, today I would say the disadvantage in Silicon Valley, it's gotten very expensive. A one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco costs $4,000 a month. The office rents are prohibitive. There's sort of the competition between companies for talent has become so intense that if your company gets into even a little bit of trouble, everybody leaves. And that's maybe not the healthiest environment in which to build a business. So I think 10 years ago, I would have argued that the positives of the network effects in Silicon Valley were absolutely dominant. Today, I think it's a much more of a mixed story. I gave a talk on the Stanford University campus in 2005, sort of a panel discussion, and the title of the panel was, "Where will we find the next Google?" Sort of like a search problem to find a company that's like the search engine. It's a very important search problem. It's a $100 billion search problem. It's sort of like an investor or employee. Where do you find it? And the answer I gave at the time was, I think it's within 5 miles of this room, 8 kilometers, within 8 kilometers of the room. And still not sure where it is, but you have to just look within 8 kilometers and you'll find it. And I think, in retrospect, one could argue that the next Google was Facebook, which was about 2 kilometers from that room. Now, if I had to give the same talk today, I think it's not a 50% chance that it's within 8 kilometers. I would say it's maybe a 30% chance that it's within 80 kilometers. So it's still a lot that's happening, but I think it's going to be much more distributed. And the places I would look in the decade ahead are I wouldn't look everywhere in the world, but I would look at all over the developed world, because I think it's in France, it's in Germany, Scandinavia, UK, maybe Japan, Korea, US. These are the countries where there is a need for technological innovation. If you're in Nigeria, if you're in India, maybe there's going to be innovation. It's not as important. In those countries, you can have a lot of progress just by copying. You will not have progress in France or the US if we just copy. And so I would be looking at Israel. I'd be looking at those parts of the world for innovation. I think it's going to be somewhat more distributed.
Yes. Peter, can you just explain how you develop in terms of customer acquisition, PayPal, in terms of you mentioned you at first you were focused on the 200 best sellers on eBay, and how did you get them? It was through Salesforce or through marketing, and after, what was the step after? And what do you recommend in terms of mix of sales and marketing to acquire a large number of companies for in a B2B service?
Well, it's what we did was fairly crazy. We basically paid everybody $10, and then you had lots of people sign up, and then it sort of grew exponentially, and the costs grew exponentially. So we started with. We launched in October of 1999. We had 24 people at our office, and it grew at 7%
per day compounding. So we had 1,000 by mid-November. We had 12,000 by December 31, 1999. We had 100,000 by February 3, 2000. We had 1 million end users by mid-April, and there were some power sellers on eBay in the process. And then, the burn rate had escalated to over 10 million a month as well. So, so you had sort of, and then we had to figure out ways to dial it back. So there are, and so it had this sort of direct viral effect, which is always one way to distribute. I think, at the time it felt like a very crazy way to do it. Maybe it still is very crazy. It was better than anything else we could come up with. And I thought you just needed to break through and get traction, and then we were able to raise more money, and then some. It's gone. All right. Well, and so that it seemed like a crazy way to do it, but we managed to break through, get traction, scale the business. I would say again, there's no categorical answer. I do think the question of distribution is always the hardest question in these businesses. It's always the one people underestimate the most. And you can always think of a startup or a technology business. It's a combination of technology and the communication of technologies. You have this technology and you are explaining to people why it works. Years ago I was at one of these events and someone said, I have a great new anti-spam technology to prevent spam in your email. And it's like, well, I have no idea if it works or not, but you have to figure out some way to convince people that it works. And you can't do it by talking to them like you're talking to me. It's too inefficient if you talk to everybody one person at a time. And so how can you convince people of your anti-spam technology without spamming people? And there's, this is sort of the general problem, is that there's an enormous amount of clutter out there. It's very, very difficult to break through. My, one general framework that I tend to think is, you can do viral marketing, you can do marketing, you can do sales, where you hire salespeople. It's a higher price point. You can hire, more expensive salespeople. It's a very, very high price point. You can do maybe business partnerships with bigger companies. So there are all these different channels for distribution. As a general matter, I think what's worked for companies, when companies succeed, you just need to get one to work. If you just get one to work, that's enough. And normally you don't have resources for more than one, so you want to try to figure out which of these can work, and then put all the effort in that one particular channel. One of the patterns I often get is you have a presentation. This is more on the revenue model side, but it also works for distribution. And a company says, we're doing, we have this big new media site with lots of traffic, and we're going to make money in one of the following 5 ways. A, through advertising, B, through subscriptions, C, by e-commerce, D, by data mining and selling things to doctors. And you have sort of like, we have A, B, C, D, E, all these different options. The list of options is a sign that you don't know what you're doing. Because it's much better to say, we're just going to make money by A, because that suggests that you've really thought through the one option that's going to work. And so the superset is actually, it's again a sign that you don't know what's going on. So that's I think often true of the revenue model. Same thing is true of distribution. So if you say we're gonna get people to use our product by radio advertising and television advertising, we're going to do internet advertising. We're going to have people with Bozo the Clown outfits running around Paris, and we're going to also have billboards on subways, and then we are going to have a lottery prize that everybody will participate in, and then there's going to be viral word of mouth marketing. We're going to do all of those things. Pattern is you don't know what. There's no reason to think any of them are working, and the fact that you're doing so many different ones is telling me that you don't think any one of them in particular is going to work.
Hey, hi Peter. here. Thanks for being here first. I have two questions about competition. So the first thing, you told us about your experience of going to Stanford and graduate school, then the law firm, and how the competition kind of didn't make sense. So the first question is, how is the new system better? Like the startup ecosystem, isn't it the most competitive ecosystem ever? And instead of being judged by academics, you're judged by VCs and business angels, and you're going to gain attention in networking events and blah, blah, blah. So it's super competitive. So how is it better? Has it changed in any way? And the second question is on the company level. You say a monopoly is good. So cabs had a monopoly, and now Uber has disrupted the monopoly and is trying to be the new monopoly. So how do you judge? How do you choose between two monopolies? Is it because it's a government monopoly? Is it because it's a global or local monopoly? So these are the two questions.
All right, two big questions there. Let me see. There's certainly a way in which the startup ecosystem can become just as sterile and stupidly competitive as the various tracked educational systems in our society. And so I think the pattern that I always resist is if there's excess homogenization, if everyone's trying to do the same thing. And so I was talking to a friend of mine a few years ago, and I was asking him, so what do you want to be doing in 5 years, 10 years time? He was like, oh, it's very clear. In 5 years, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. And I think that's always a terrible answer, because that's even though it's a French word, and it's like saying I want to be rich, I want to be famous. It's too abstract, and so if your goal is to get a graduate degree or to be a startup CEO, that's again, it's too abstract, and that's sort of and on that level, it can very much be the same mistake. And then I think, but I do think at its best, the business formation context is one where the challenge is to differentiate very powerfully. What are you doing that other people are not doing? And you're not, you can choose to do something where it's the exact same thing. So we're going to sell dog food on the internet, and there are 20 other e-commerce sites that are selling dog food. This was sort of one of the themes of the 90s tech bubble. There was Pets.com and Petopia, and there were like 20 of these dog food selling sites. And that was the hyper-competitive, hyper-mimetic, runaway imitation, runaway competition. Did not work. But I think you can always choose to do something very different. And I think that's somewhat harder to do in our educational system, where the structure just is to pressure you to compete in set ways. So startups can be like that. I don't think they have to be. I think on the question of when is I think on the inside you always want to have a monopoly. So if you're a cab driver, you have a medallion, you want to keep it. If you're Uber, you have this emerging monopoly, definitely you like to have that too. There's a different question from the outside, from the point of view of society. What monopolies are good? What monopolies are bad? And we treat them very differently. We have antitrust laws against bad monopolies, where the monopoly is sort of like a rent collector, or it's like a tax collector at a bridge, where you just sort of collect a toll. I think certainly a lot of the telecom companies, cable companies, sometimes feel like they're close to bad monopolies. Post office, I often think was kind of a bad monopoly. And then we also have laws to protect good monopolies with patents, intellectual property, because if you don't get a monopoly in your ideas, they will be stolen too easily, and somehow not enough will be rewarded. So there's always, from the social perspective, it's always this very tricky question: when are the monopolies? When are the monopolies good? When are they bad? I think that this is good. I think in a dynamic world, you do new things, and it creates new value. So you'd say Apple had a monopoly on smartphones for a number of years, but this was not a bad monopoly where it created artificial scarcity. because before Apple, there were no smartphones at all that worked. And so it was actually creating, so this was a dynamic thing. It was not, so in a dynamic world, I think the monopolies can be good. In a static world, over time, they become like rent collectors and bad. And so it's always a little bit of a judgment, which it is. I would say, you know, on the Uber versus cab driver dynamic, you know, one of the reasons, by the way, that the fight is so intense is that they're not as differentiated as they would like to be. So this is, and this is why I think I'm an investor in Airbnb, and this is why I still think Airbnb is going to have fewer regulatory challenges than Uber, because the regulatory challenges always come from the intense competition where the competitors then want to be protected, or existing quasi-monopolies want to be protected, and that sort of gets the regulatory piece going. So you could say Airbnb is somewhat threatening to hotels, but it's just very different. So it's only indirectly really competing with hotels, and it's mostly just doing something very new. Whereas Uber is sort of a much more zero-sum competitive dynamic, and that's why you know, whatever you think of the regulations here in Paris or elsewhere, it feels very natural to me that Uber is the sort of company that will end up having far more regulatory challenges than a company like Airbnb.
Hi, Peter. I'm still chez, co-founder and CEO of Lydia. We're a mobile payment company based out of France. We believe that mobile payment should replace cash, not contactless cards at McDonald's checkout. Today we have about 300,000 users in France, and adding a new 1,000 users every day. We focus on college campuses where we having presence in over 180 of them. And we change basically the way people pay on that campuses and exchange money with each other. In about 2 months, we have half the campus using our system. We raised 3 million about 1.5 years ago. And we're now raising a new round of financing. So my question is going to be pretty personal. Would you give me 5 minutes for a pitch?
I'm always really bad at answering these questions on the spot here. But no, it's again, I can't evaluate anything based on a 3-minute description or even a 30-minute description. I can't because as I suggested in my talk, the kinds of questions I would have to know more about are what are other people doing, what are the barriers, you know, all sorts of things like this. So I'd have to sort of understand the whole context in ways that I don't remotely understand. I would say one of the challenges with payments companies is, and I think this is true of many other things, but I somehow always think it's unusually true, even more true of payments than many other areas, is it's back to the distribution question. How do you get people to use your product? And you need to have something that's dramatically better for some set of people, so that some early people start using it. So there needs to be like a very big delta for some set of people. And one of the problems with payments or with many other areas is that we have systems that exist that are not great. We often have systems in our society, they work, but they don't work well. They're okay, they're not very good. And we can envision systems that would work much better. But these systems that would work, but there's no natural transition to go from the bad system of today to the very good system of tomorrow. Because the very good system of tomorrow is, there's no single person who has an incredibly urgent need to adopt it. And so the question is always, where is, you know, who are the small subset of people where there's a very steep gradient? So when PayPal started, we had sort of going to be the new world currency, replace the dollar. And there's, you know, maybe there's a lot that's wrong with the dollar. You know, it's printed by money, it's fiat, it's dirty, it's unhygienic, you get diseases when you touch money. There are all these things I could say where it's a bad thing, and if we got rid of the dollar, we could get to a much better world. Very hard to transition. You know, it's like, you know, I'm going to give you a chicken, and I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you a new piece of paper, and you give me all your cash. Doesn't quite work, you know. And so getting the transition to work really, really hard. What we did succeed at PayPal was not a new currency, but a new payment system, and it was on a very narrow place where you had these power sellers on eBay who couldn't accept credit cards, and so in the U.S. they still had to use checks. So it was incredibly backwards, more backwards than anything you had in Europe. Took them 7 to 10 days, and then if you could do something faster, you could get those people to adopt it. I don't think you could have built PayPal in Europe in the late 90s because people, at least in certain parts, because people weren't using checks. And so the payment systems were actually more developed, and so paradoxically, that meant you couldn't come up with something that was enough of an improvement to bring people to adopt something new. So I think there's always this question, where is the subset of the users where the intensity is so great, the pain is so great, the need for it is so great to adopt it. And one should always avoid these kinds of systems where it's sort of, it's a tiny benefit for 1 billion people.
Okay, I think we have time for one very last quick question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Zelina Alec. I'm a co-founder and CEO at a startup productivity app called TimeJoy. I've been out of Silicon Valley for a few months, so since you're, I think, just came back from there, I'm just wondering, so I read on the news a lot about the bubble bursting and the bloodbath that's happening there now, layoffs and valuations going down. So I was wondering to get your perspective on what's happening really there and how that might affect what's going to happen with the funding investor environment in Europe. Thank you.
Well, let's see. I think that you know, the thing that I've said is I think that bubbles are psychosocial phenomena. The bubbles happen when the public gets involved. So we had a bubble in the late 90s when you had a lot of tech IPOs. We had a housing bubble in the 2000s where everybody was frantically trying to buy a house. I'm not sure that there is a bubble in Silicon Valley today for the simple reason that the public at large has not been involved. You know, in 1999, there were 300 tech companies that had IPOs in Silicon Valley. I think in 2015, it was something like 15 or 20 companies maybe. So the companies are staying private much longer, and it is not a dynamic that's pulled in that's sort of pulled in the whole society in the way in which the dot-com bubble in the late 90s or the housing bubble in the 2000s did. Now, I think it's possible there are distortions. I've said, I think there are some bubbles we have in our society. I often talk about the education bubble, where I think there's a lot that's gone wrong there. I think there is probably some sort of bubble around government debt and the money printing. There's a bubble with these very strange negative interest rates that you have in Europe, and these sort of quantitative easing bubbles do actually affect everybody, including Silicon Valley. So I think it's possible that there's a distortion in valuations, that there's going to be some sort of correction in the months and years ahead, but I think that it's a mistake to see it as somehow centered on Silicon Valley this time. I think if it's centered anywhere, it's centered on the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, the various central banks that have been printing money like crazy, and the center of the distortion is something like government bonds rather than startup equities. The line I had over the last 5-6 years is that I thought the two big macroeconomic trends were that our governments were fighting a war on cash because they were printing money, and they were fighting a war on credit because they were regulating the banks more and more. The two wars, in many ways, cancel each other out, so it's a self-contradictory war. The war on cash, you print money, and the war on credit says the banks can't do anything with the money that you printed. And so the two wars sort of cancel out. We don't get too much inflation because they have this canceling effect. But as an investor, I've thought you want to be very far away from cash and very far away from credit, because that's where those are the things that are getting destroyed. So you don't want to be in a bank. You don't want to have all your money in cash. And investing in startups has been, venture capital as an asset class, I would argue, is something that's been very far from cash and very far from credit. So I think, even though I don't think it's immune to the QE bubble, I think one could argue that it's about as far away as you can get from what I think the real bubble is.
All right, thank you very much. I'm sorry.